Canada. Please join me giving a warm welcome to Grant and Faryar.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucas, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. And Grant, especially thank you to you and your team for being a part of this. It's really important. There's a lot of work that goes into developing a regulatory framework around a new industry, but ultimately the tone has to be set at the top, and just the fact that you're here and eager to be in dialogue with companies like ours who are interested in registering, complying, being part of your regulatory framework, but also everybody here who wants to hear from you. So thanks to you for being part of that.
It's our pleasure on behalf of the entire team.
So it's really interesting, at Coinbase, one of the things that Brian Armstrong's asked us to do is to work actively with regulators all around the world to try to figure out what the right regulatory framework should be around crypto. You actually and your colleagues at the OSC have been pathfinders in the sense that about a year ago you decided that you were essentially going to draw a line in the sand and begin the path towards providing regulatory clarity and a path to registration with the pre-registration undertaking. It was a very sort of, when you look at it in a global context, it was quite a big step. Can you talk about how that came to be, what your thought was behind it, and how you feel like it's gone from an execution perspective?
Well, in advance of the pre-registration undertakings, we were in the process of registering as restricted dealers a significant number of Canadian entities that were entering the crypto asset space. But, they faced significant competition from global players that weren't subject to regulation in Canada or in their home jurisdictions to a significant degree. So part of it was to level the playing field, because there was a turning point where the international players wanted to come into compliance in Canada. It was going to be it couldn't be a short process. The issues are too substantial. So with the domestic entrants, the fact that global players, galloped ahead and had significant access to Canadian consumers, a desire to bring the global players into the fold, to have a level playing field to allow true competition. The idea of a pre-registration undertaking where the fundamental principles of crypto asset regulation drawn from securities regulation could be put into force it just seemed like a logical step to take, that while we go through this lengthy process, we needed to make sure that these fundamental principles were being observed. And it was really readily accepted by global players who wished to come to Canada, and did achieve more of a level playing field.
One of the interesting things is that the registration makes sense for companies like Coinbase, big central intermediaries. Our role is to take assets and money from clients, hold it, execute trades on their behalf. But crypto, as you know as well as anyone, is a technology. It has a broad range of applications. A lot of the founders here are thinking about crypto in a way different than necessarily trading it as a speculative asset, and perhaps are building businesses that aren't centralized intermediaries. How do you think about that in terms of your role as a securities regulator, the need to regulate intermediaries like us, but also to be mindful that there's a broad range of applications that are out there as well?
Well, you can certainly have technological applications that don't implicate securities regulation or that are utility functions within securities regulation. Clearly the blockchain can be used as a more effective clearance and settlement system. And our role would be in that regard, as that develops, to make sure all the safeguards are in place that we would apply to a traditional clearing agency. But the reality is that the industry to date has been built on speculative trading, and with significant consumer investor protection issues that we've seen materialize in Canada, beginning with Quadriga and other instances. So, our focus had to be on investor protection in respect of this speculative trading boom, which, really has been the backbone. The application of crypto blockchain technology to other use cases is something that will emerge more fully from that foundation. But while that speculative trading is underway and is largely retail, there's a pressing need to regulate to ensure adequate investor protection, and that this grand technology, which I believe has a lot of continues to have a lot of promise into the future, isn't built on at the expense of retail investors.
One of the things that we've noticed in our own interaction with your team is the degree to which there's an open door at the agency. I mean, your presence here is obviously indicative of the culture that you've set, but also your team is extraordinarily good about talking through issues with us. Sometimes, they'll ask for something, we'll have difficulty with it, we talk it through.
Sometimes I feel we're a consulting firm.
Well, I don't want to ask a question that stops you or your team from doing that, but have you found that to be useful? I mean, listen, I have to tell you, it's not necessarily typical. Some regulators are better about that. More others hide behind the curtain and sort of lop messages over the wall, and it becomes hard to know what the expectations are. Was that a decision you made, or is that the?
No, I think it's really the Canadian regulatory culture, and it's been that way for many years. And I think traditional market participants in Canada overall would if they have a basis for comparison with other jurisdictions, would find that we've always had a more open door approach, and that we benefit from the exchange that we have with market participants. It helps us be better informed. It produces candor, a stronger dialogue, and then once an entity's in the regulatory tent, it means that you can call us and we can call you, and have influence over events in real time without having an artificial distance between us. So it's always been that way. It's a breath of fresh air for me after practicing in the U.S.
Yeah, for us as well. One of the interesting things is obviously the vision of crypto is ultimately as a decentralized, very autonomous, self-directed medium. I mean, in a way, it's the evolution of crypto as a technology that can update the financial system is not all that different from the internet as a technology that updates how people aggregate and can access information and empowers the individual in a different way. As you and I just talked about a minute ago, that raises different questions. It's a different paradigm. As people begin to, now I know this is sort of down the road, but it'd be interesting what your early thoughts are on what does the decentralized world mean to you as a regulator? The paradigm is different. The regulatory need is different, I think, although you may disagree with that.
Well, I do think a truly decentralized system, or I don't even know if I could call it a system anymore, but that type of paradigm is a long way off, and that we've found that claims of decentralization are often exaggerated, and there are a variety of market participants that are performing functions analogous to market makers, dealers, clearing agencies, and almost every category of securities regulated entity. So I think the claims have to be examined closely. It will be a challenge to the regulatory system to assert jurisdiction over the entities that are on the periphery, that are not core to the exchange of value in a decentralized system. But I do think that there's going to be money to be made, and there'll be a degree of centralization that'll be inevitable. I also think that not only securities regulators, but other financial regulators and central banks are going to push back against an increasing decentralization because and I think some people are seeking this objective. It loosens the regulatory authority and monetary authority and systemic authority that governmental entities will have. And that's really a dilemma today because, of course, platforms and other crypto entities are seeking to enter the traditional finance world, to be institutional, at the same time that there's an underlying principle that's decentralizing. And that's actually a paradox, and that I think will result in some pushback by not only securities regulators, but others.
People, I know in the U.S. debate and other places as well, people say, well, where are the use cases of crypto? The most obvious use case, and it's at a gigantic scale, is the use of crypto as a payment instrument, and stablecoins obviously being the kind of the peak of that. You've decided to call them VRCAs, value reference crypto assets, treat them as securities for regulatory purposes. What's your thought about that? How did you come at it that way? Other jurisdictions treat it as a payment under their payment authority, under their regulatory authority. Some treat it under their banking regulatory framework. And what's your thought in terms of your approach?
Well, it's, we recognize the role that VRCAs or stablecoins play in the crypto ecosystem. They're paired with what we would assert are clearly crypto asset contracts that constitute investment contracts. So in a way, the VRCAs are part and parcel of the investment contract in our minds because they're instrumental in the pairing of and trading of crypto asset contracts, which we regard as either investment contracts or derivatives. So, and in our mind, they can't really be separated. And if they're not separated, then they're entwined with speculative trading by investors and require protection. There's also, we could also argue whether they constitute debt instruments under Canadian case law. There's a very strong argument that they constitute securities because of their debt characterization. Some think that they should perform a function or be regulated in a manner similar to money market instruments. But our fundamental point of view is that we end up being default regulators because there's no national legislation that actually introduces and regulates VRCAs as in our payment system in Canada. So given that they're entwined with retail trading and there's no legislative framework and there continues to be investor risk and actual risk if the underlying reserves are not present, we feel it's our essential role to regulate that space until there's an alternative regime that has prudential and conduct regulation.
When you see other jurisdictions with broader adoption of stablecoins or embracing it more as a matter of public policy, does that inform your view, or you, because ultimately markets are global, the crypto markets are particularly globalized. How does the global context influence your approach to different issues?
Oh, it does have a strong influence, and our present position on VRCAs isn't to prohibit them. It's to allow them as long as there's real auditable information about the reserves that are certified. And the sticking point, frankly, has been the issue of us requiring, treating the entity that's issuing the VRCAs as an issuer of securities. And if they're an issuer of securities and there's a credit exposure to the holder, we care about seeing the financial statements of the VRCA issuer. So there's a path forward, but unfortunately, many of the VRCA stablecoin issuers don't want to be transparent about their financial condition. One
interesting aspect of blockchain technology is all the way on the other end of that spectrum. Traditional financial firms interested in adopting the technology and updating capital markets activities, speeding up the settlement cycle for capital markets transactions, interbank settlement. Can you talk about that and sort of the role of OSC in terms of facilitating or enabling that sort of modernization?
We're very interested in it. We have discussions with exchanges and clearinghouses about the opportunities for blockchain, atomic clearance and settlement, and it has a lot of promise in being a measure that will be risk reducing and actually will tie up less capital. So it'll be actually important for intermediaries as well. So that use case is a very powerful one, and we'd be very open to talk to those who want to introduce that type of clearing on their platforms or exchanges in Canada, as long as we have the same safeguards that we would have for a recognized clearing agency.
One of the things that regulators around the world struggle with sometimes is the slogan tech neutrality, and they worry sometimes. They'll say, well, we want to allow the adoption of innovative technologies, but we don't want to favor one methodology or another. When I talk to regulators or policymakers, I say, well, the concept of tech neutrality is hard. In principle, it makes sense. In application, it's quite complicated. If you try to create a tech-neutral outcome in terms of an email versus a paper letter, you'd have to, by regulation, disfavor the email so that people will still be indifferent to emailing versus sending a paper letter. Are you comfortable with the disruptive implications of the adoption of blockchain technology in traditional capital markets activities?
Well, we follow the experiments. There have been a lot of experiments, especially in debt capital markets in Europe and some in Asia, to exploring clearance and settlement and custody, distribution, and even some melding of these settlement mechanisms with kind of predictive analysis about the logical buyers for debt instruments. So yeah, I'm really interested in those developments. They're much more extensive in Europe, often involving US banks active in Europe that are exploring those technologies. They haven't been as readily applicable to equity capital markets as debt distribution. I'm not worried about, to date, I'm not worried about the disruptive capabilities because these experiments are being conducted on a scale that's almost like a sandbox. And I think it's being thoughtfully overseen by the investment banks and others that have been pursuing it. I do care about not disrupting the large incumbent utilities that our securities markets depend upon. So I care about our clearing system being allowed to operate in a safe and sound manner, and that new entrants have to be introduced carefully to avoid too much disruption to a system that's working very well.
So let me close out by asking one kind of big picture question. Lucas, at the outset, was talking about how in our own surveys we find that the Canadian consumers are among maybe the third most crypto forward population among the global sort of markets that we've surveyed. Your own analysis shows that I think we're approaching something like 30% of the population potentially buying crypto, I think over the course of the year ahead. This is a very crypto forward population. As a policymaker, regulator, how do you think about that? How does that frame your thinking as your closing thought?
It makes me want to redouble our efforts to get it right in terms of regulatory balance, because there is that demand, and Canadians are early adopters and more active adopters of crypto asset instruments and technology. So it means that we have to, it's really the reason we have to devote such extensive resources to the sector that's really outsized in relation to the value traded. But we're putting a lot into it because not only younger Canadians, but younger Canadians to a very large degree are showing such intense interest in the sector. So we have to get it right. If we don't get it right, I'm worried that that those investors are going to be sent off course in their investment planning for their lifetimes, that they're going to become disenchanted with the regulatory and financial system if the platforms or we get this wrong, that we have a duty to the public to make sure that that this fits into an appropriate investment structure, and that they're not misled into decision making that could harm their futures. So I think we all have a collective responsibility to nurture those aspirations of Canadians and get the balance right.
Well, we really appreciate you being here. We appreciate your team for how thoughtful they are and the vision you've set. So thank you for joining us.